Our next conversation today is with Colorado State Climatologist Russ Schumacher of Colorado State University. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So last week's fires have a lot of Coloradans concerned that we could see a really dangerous wildfire season this summer and this fall. What do you think?
Yeah, well, we saw these fires over the last week. They blew up really quickly, got pretty big pretty fast. The good news is the firefighters have done good work. The weather's helped out a little bit. They've calmed down. This week is going to be humid, cooler, rainy, so hopefully we'll be okay at least in the near term. But we've got big fire out in the West Slope as well, and the kind of medium range outlook out through the fall and even into the early winter is pointing towards warmer and drier than average conditions continuing. So those are the weather and climate conditions we tend to look at as those hot, dry conditions. And also, the spring was pretty wet and last year was extremely wet. And that's often the bad situation is when you go from wet to dry, you build up all the fuels and then it gets hot and dry and they dry out and then they're ready to burn at that point.
Mm-hmm. How often does the climatological setup correlate with a bad fire year? So people will remember, 2012, so you got Waldo Canyon, you got High Park, you got Lower North Fork. Then you had 2020, which was the worst year yet, Cameron Peak, East Troublesome, Pine Gulch. How often does a bad setup result in a bad fire year?
Yeah, the really bad fire years we've had have been these hot, dry, drought years and also really warm. So there, thinking back to 2000, there aren't too many of those years where it was really hot and dry that we didn't have pretty substantial fire activity. 2022 might be the only exception to that. That was a pretty hot summer as well, and we kind of got through that one without a lot. But right, exactly. These years you mentioned, when we run down when were the really bad droughts here in Colorado over the last 20 years, it was 2002 and 2012 and 2018 and 2020. Getting there this year, and those are the same years that we think about with the big fires.
How do the conditions this year stack up to those years, stack up to like a 2020?
Yeah, not up to this point, not so bad. So August of 2020, if we look at the climate statistics, it stands pretty far outside of any other summer month that is in there. June, July of 2012 are kind of up in that ranking. But like August of 2020, you just look at the statistics and it's like, how was it that hot and that dry for basically the whole month of August? And that's when all those big fires got started. We're not quite there this year. There's some spots along the Front Range. Boulder, for example, had their driest May, June, July on record. The 3 months that just ended. Fort Collins, we were the second driest over that time period. So it is really drying out. If we had an August that was as hot as 2020, I think we'd be in real bad shape. The good news, at least in the short term, is these next few days, like later this week into the weekend, are looking a lot tamer. We should get some rain most places, so at least that will help in the near term. But if we have a fall that, you hate to bring up what happened in 2021, where it was wet in the spring and then it was just 6 months of dry leading up to the Marshall Fire in the winter. I hope that's not where we're headed, but the kind of climate outlooks for the fall are all pointing to warmer and drier than average as La Nina comes back in. That's the condition that tends to be dry, especially in the fall on the Front Range and Eastern Plains.
So all of Colorado's 20 largest fires in recorded history have been since 2001. 9 of the 20 largest fires have been since 2018, including 4 of the 5 largest all time in that shortened time span. What are we seeing?
Yeah, I think around 2000, just all of this sort of changed, right? Like 2002 was this huge fire, the Hayman Fire, and other big ones so I moved here to Colorado in 2001, and that was kind of a rude introduction there. And then, they've just been kind of frequent in those dry years since then. Climate change is definitely a part of the story, right? So the warmer it is, when those drought years come along, drought is a natural cycle. It's something that happens naturally. But when those dry years come along and it's hotter, the air is basically thirstier for water. So the air is trying to pull more water out of wherever it can get it, the soils, the forests, the reservoirs, the river systems, all of that. And so hot and dry is worse than just dry. And so that's definitely a part of the equation that we're seeing here. As our climate warms, summer is when the warming has been most prominent. Summer and fall have been when the warming has been most prominent over the last few decades. and that's obviously when, when it's warmest naturally. And so all of those things are kind of coming together to make it so that when the fires start, they have, a better chance essentially of growing into these huge destructive fires that grow really quickly, like we've seen in since 2000.
Mm-hmm. That would seem to suggest that the pattern that's setting up is likely to sustain itself then for a while.
Yeah, so that, exactly. I mean, really all the science points to, over the western U.S. in general, more area burned in wildfires. That's certainly been the case in California in recent years with so many huge fires there. So exactly, and it does kind of turn into a sort of vicious cycle where the warmer it gets, the more it dries out, which makes it more favorable for fire. That turns out that releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is not what you want from the perspective of climate change. And so it really, I think, has been kind of a shift since 2000 or so. Of course, wildfires are complicated, right? It's not just weather and climate, it's the fuels part. So, what's happening in the forest is important. And, a lot of the fires that get started are, we don't know all the causes of the ones going on right now, but a lot of them are human caused. So the more people we have up recreating in the mountains, if people aren't careful with fire, that also is probably a contributing factor to some of this.
Yeah, we don't want to remove human agency from this, right? It's people making good decisions versus bad decisions that impact a lot of this. Yeah. I want to talk about climate change more broadly and its impacts in Colorado, and maybe sort things into three buckets, right? There's the stuff that is definitely scientifically proven that is related to climate change. There are the open questions that might be related to climate change. And then there's stuff related to climate or weather that is not climate change. Maybe we can kind of sort those things out. Let's take them in reverse order. What is not climate change related that sometimes gets mixed up in that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably not a whole lot that we can say that it's absolutely not changing. It's more an issue of we don't have the data or we just don't really know. So one thing along those topics that actually is relevant for wildfires is these big downslope windstorms that we get here on the Front Range, like the one that caused the Marshall Fire. There's not really a lot of indication of those becoming more frequent. There's maybe some indication that they're becoming even less frequent, the really intense ones. So that's when they're like tornadoes on the eastern plains, for example. They may be changing. The climatology of tornadoes might be changing, but it's tough to tell because we don't have a lot of data, and the data we have is based on people seeing them. And there's more people here in Colorado, so it's hard to know.
Sure.
So that those are ones where maybe climate change is playing a role, but we don't really have a good sense of even in what direction those are changing.
How about that middle bucket where there's a high likelihood the data suggests this is related to changing climate, but it's not rock solid?
Yeah, so I think here in Colorado, extreme precipitation is one of those. If you look in coastal areas like the East Coast or the Midwest, places that have an ample source of moisture, the warmer the atmosphere is, the more water vapor there can be in the atmosphere, and thus when it does rain, it can rain harder. And if you look at the data in, say, the Southeast or the Midwest, or especially, like the Northeast, the frequency of extreme rain events has gone up, and we're going to see another huge rain event in the Southeast here over the next couple of days with Tropical Storm Debbie. Here in Colorado, it's a little bit murkier because we're far away from the moisture sources. It's a pretty dry place in general, so we have to get the moisture in from somewhere else. Last summer was one of the wettest summers we've ever had here, on the Front Range. But it's still kind of hard to know for sure whether that, is a signal of climate change or just, we just had a really wet summer here. So I think that's one where the evidence points to extreme rain being more frequent. We can show it clear, it can be shown clearly in some regions, but here in Colorado, it's a little tougher to tell.
Mm-hmm. And then what is in that third bucket? This is absolutely the result of a changing climate. It's beyond scientific debate.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is heat, right? So the climate is warming, hot conditions, heat waves are becoming more frequent. So that one is pretty clear, and you can pretty easily draw that line. And then the other ones are the things where you can kind of directly link it to heat. So drought is one of those. as I was talking about, right? Like when the dry conditions come around and it's also hot, that's worse than if it was just dry. So we see when droughts are happening now, they tend to be more intense. They happen a little bit more frequently. The odds are kind of tilted towards drought happening, and when it happens, being more severe. And then that plays into wildfires. So there's, kind of continually growing evidence that wildfires in the western U.S., there's increases in area burned in wildfires, the kind of weather conditions that are in place for the explosive growth of fires, which is, hot, dry, windy conditions, that those are becoming more likely. And so those are the ones that kind of, rank up there at the top. So if folks are interested, we actually have a chart so we published, our office led a climate change in Colorado updated report that was published earlier this year. We've got a chart that kind of lays this out exactly. The top ones are like, these are the things that we're very confident in that are changing, like heat waves, drought, wildfires, in the middle of some of those like rainfall extremes, and at the bottom, like windstorms, tornadoes, hail, things like that, where it's tough to tell.
A last question for you. So we've been talking about the impacts of a changing climate on Colorado, but I often read that Denver metro area especially is going to be one of the most climate resilient and climate safe cities in America over the next 50 years. And that as a result, we might actually see an influx of population from people wanting to get out of the Southwest, the South, coastal cities. Is Denver going to be safer?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely things working in our favor here in Colorado. You can go to the mountains. Like there's places in Colorado in the mountains that have never reached 90 degrees. I mean, you can go up to the top of a mountain peak. It's probably never even been 80 degrees up there. So that's, attractive for people to kind of get away from the heat. Even if the front range gets really hot, like it's been the last couple of weeks, well, you can drive up to the mountains and it'll be cooler, right? So that is an advantage. Our nights are cooler than a lot of places because of our low humidity. So that's something that is nice compared to a lot of other areas. It's the wildfires and the smoke that I think is the thing that is potentially going to turn people off in that. We've had a lot of smoke. 2020 was terrible with so many fires nearby. But even when the fires are not as active here in Colorado, the smoke's coming in from California or Canada or the Northwest or wherever, that's one of those things where I think people, in the Western U.S. where that increase in wildfire smoke is sort of turning them off to what otherwise is a really nice climate here, right? Like our climate in Colorado is a lot nicer than a lot of other places because it doesn't get extremely hot. The nights are cool. There's a way to get relief by going up in the mountains, but it's this wildfire risk that really, literally kind of is in people's faces.
Appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's on a lot of people's minds, so look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.